I'm Rick Dadarian, and you're listening to Realms of Memory. Remembering the partition of British India isn't just about confronting the violence and the trauma caused by the unmixing of populations. It's also about the memories of the cultural entanglements that once bound together the people from this region. Photos, music, and food are just a few of the examples of cultural forms that can remind us and connect us to people, places, and times that no longer exist but continue to resonate. Cultural reminders of a shared past have the potential to bridge the distrust, resentment, and animosity that often come from difficult and divisive national histories. Anania Kabir, a professor of literature at King's College London, has spent years using her critical skills to analyze the cultural entanglements in South Asia. Her family comes from the region of Bengal and now live in the 3 countries that were once part of British India. For Anania, the story of cultural entanglements is a personal one, which she discusses in her book, Partitions Post-Amnesias, 1947, 1971, and Modern South Asia, which will be the subject of my conversation with her today. Anania Kabir, thanks for joining Realms of Memory.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here with you.
Now, I can't resist just starting with a question, because you begin your academic career working on medieval literature, and that's really the focus of first couple books, right? What causes you to shift your focus to South Asia?
You know, this is actually so crucial in understanding my career, because while I was in the middle of my PhD, 1997, we were into 50 years of Indian independence and partition. And I remember vividly feeling not torn, feeling a bit like, deflected. I had this obsessive focus on the European Middle Ages, which was my PhD. And suddenly there were other histories, other commemorations, which I was getting glimpses of. Remember, this is 1997, so we don't have the internet working in the way it does today. But I could still sense that there was a conversation opening up about what had happened 50 years ago in India, to create India, as it were. And I realized anew how important this conversation was for my family, for how I was what I was. And it started me on a journey that ultimately took me away from the European Middle Ages and towards the South Asia, which I was kind of born into, And I can definitely say that the 50th anniversary of Indian independence and partition was definitely what made me want to enter the realm of memory, which is South Asia today.
Mm-hmm. So there's a commemorative memory trigger that inspires the beginnings of that research.
Absolutely.
And when you start to look into this field of partition studies, I mean, it is really changing dramatically in the 1990s. So that's the period where it's really opening up. I think you make the case, though, that there are still some significant absences, which is really the focus, at least the area of focus of your book. So which areas had received more attention in partition studies, and how did you try to address that imbalance?
Right. So what was happening in 1997 is that we suddenly had a critical mass of books appearing, mostly with an oral history and feminist emphasis, to recover stories of women in particular that had been silenced by these nationalist narratives of independence. Nations coming of age through the anti-colonial struggle, India as well as Pakistan. And what had been forgotten is that certain groups of people had been caught in the midst of those processes, and their micro-histories had not been told. So certain books started emerging, people like Ritu Menon, Urvashi Butalia, Kamla Bhasin, these are legendary names now. They started collecting oral histories of women who were still alive at that time, who had lived through that. And they started drawing attention to these hidden and obscure narratives. And this was part of this memory triggered, as you put it, but a kind of alternative one to the big stories of 50 years of the nation that were being celebrated officially. But interestingly enough, because of the positionality of these pioneering women who were bringing these stories to the public sphere, these stories tended to cluster on that side of the Indian subcontinent, which we call the Punjab, this area, the region of the Punjab, which was partitioned between Pakistan and India, which is on the western side of the Indian subcontinent. Those stories started coming out more and more of what happened to people caught in that particular, set of events. And as a person from the region known as Bengal, which is kind of on the opposite side, on the eastern side of the Indian subcontinent, I knew that there were other complementary interlock stories which were being missed out, which hadn't yet been heard properly. Of course, there was mention of the Bengal, what had happened to Bengal in the partition. All the people talking about the Punjab, like Urvashi and Kamla and Ritu, were mentioning Bengal, but they were not going to Bengal, to talk about what had happened there. So I realized that there was, in this critical mass that was suddenly hitting us, there were also gaps inevitably. And I felt that was where I wanted to step in. And I also wanted to bring my literary critical tools. I'm not a collector of oral histories, and I'm not a historian. I'm not an ethnographer. I'm not a sociologist. I'm a literary critic. What does that mean? What kind of angles can I bring onto the materials that I know exist there, which I want to plug the gaps with?
But to me, it seems, and this is one of the things that struck me, if you're looking at the work on the memory of partition, novelists are the ones who are really the first to tackle the subject, and historians are kind of late to take this on. So if having a training in literary studies is where you came from, to me, it seems like there couldn't be a better background to take into this particular field.
Absolutely. And I would say that literary studies is a composite package. What it really means is that we use certain theoretical approaches to the study of human culture and kind of retool them, to look at, say, texts or films or whatever. And one set of theoretical approaches that were open to me because I was a literary critic and I could kind of understand those approaches were really what the tools that were being used to understand the memorial impact of the Holocaust, And by the 1990s, a significant body of criticism and scholarly work existed, which was grappling with what it meant for, the Holocaust to have happened, what it meant to be survivors of the camps, of the concentration camps, what it meant for people in America who had fled, Europe and were now kind of part of an intelligentsia in the Americas. Because they had brought with them, their culture, their knowledge, their refinement and their learning. And in a way, the Jewish experience in America also started reminding me of what had happened to Indian Muslims because of the partition, So the different ways in which, as a literary critic, I could access a lot of very poignant and acutely, sharp, in a way, scholarship on a European and American legacy of the Second World War. And that was going by the kind of broad term of Holocaust studies. And there was a really intimate relationship building up between memory studies in general and Holocaust studies in particular. As a literary critic, I could access those materials. I could understand what tools they were using, psychoanalysis, close reading, symptomatic reading, and so on. And I could say, right, I can bring all this material and see how we can look at the after effects, the responses to the Indian partition through this toolkit. So as a literary critic, I think not only was I able to see what was out there in terms of literary responses to the partition, historians were seeing that too. but I could say, listen, I know how to analyze this stuff using a certain set of methods that we develop in departments such as in English literature departments, So that was really where I stepped in the late 1990s.
So one of the points I thought that was interesting at the start of your book is you mentioned that one of the pitfalls of looking at partition is we're often looking at it in terms of narrative sources of memories, and narratives have certain drawbacks when you're trying to understand the past, and you try to take a different approach by looking at non-narrative types of sources. Could you explain what are some of the drawbacks of narrative approaches to trying to understand partition, and what are non-narrative sources that you tried to look at?
Thanks for that again, because it really is an interesting continuation of the earlier question or the earlier observation you made that I'm a literary critic. And so, my training makes me sensitive to, say, the novels out there about partition or the short stories. It's another very fertile genre for responses to partition. And these, whether they're novels or whether they're short stories, they're taking the forms of narratives, They have beginnings, middles, and ends. And again, it's my training as a literary critic, the fact that we teach our students what it means to have stories, what form and shape the stories must take, but also the politics that telling stories smuggle in through their very form, All this made me understand, ironically, that there were narratives out there about partition, and there were also certain biases or dangers or foreclosures associated with narratives. If you tell a story, that story is inevitably someone's story, and it's not going to be someone else's story. Do you see what I mean? There are certain, once you push that button and say, start, a story can only take a certain form. You can try to break it. You can try to wrestle with the form. Salman Rushdie does a great job of that. But it's ultimately still kind of trapped between the pages of a text, which has a certain beginning, middle, and end, cause and effect. Once you set that machine rolling, there's only so much you can depart from it. So I thought, interesting, I'm going to look for other ways in which partition can be responded to. Surely stories can't be the only thing out there. What happens if you sing a song about partition? What happens if you paint a visual memory of partition? What do you do with that? How do you analyze it? And what other feelings can be transmitted, can be captured, can we detect by shifting our focus, to those arguably more slippery, more difficult to understand responses. But while they may be difficult to unpack and understand, they're not difficult for us to sense. Do you know what I mean? We can feel, we can have a communion of feeling. But my job as a critic is to say, well, how does that actually work? And so in my book, I was determined to shine the spotlight on some of these more opaque forms of commemoration, opaque because they did not yield to the protocols of storytelling, which in a way we are more attuned to following and understanding.
And to me, it seems that one of the points you were trying to make too is that you have this region that's interconnected, and once you reduce it, or you reduce the stories of the respective countries that come out of partition to narrative form, you're just rigidifying the borders, the divisions between them. And if you're looking at these cultural artifacts that are left over, it gives you a greater opportunity to understand the connections between them. You've got to look at them in a more complex way. That was my take, is that it seemed like these non-narrative sources, cultural sources, whether it's a painting, whether it's a song, a sculpture, a photo, give you a better chance of trying to understand that past in a way that has a greater chance of promoting healing and reconciliation. That seems to be a high up on your agenda with this project.
It was definitely one of my arguments. And in a way, it's an argument that I had already started exploring in the book that I wrote before I wrote the Partition book, which was on Kashmir, which is like an all-out conflict zone, in our region. And there too, I had argued strongly for the problematics of narrative and how narratives or stories are only too easily hijacked by certain groups and made into an us versus them kind of, template. Whereas I argued that moving as far away from stories with endings as possible, we had better chances of activating some other circuit of feeling that could draw us together as human beings and as people with a shared and not just divided history. So absolutely, I was trying, and I still am trying in the work I'm doing now, to constantly, as a scholar, I am provoked and constantly, challenged by textuality, because in dialogue with non-textual forms, I can understand in a way the text even better, So I'm kind of I think by now, 30 years or more of reading texts, I'm pretty sure what they can do and what they don't do. Do you know what I'm saying? And that realization makes me want to look at interlocked forms of remembering. Nothing really can exist without the other. A non-textual job, like if you go to see a sculpture, in a park, what are the chances that there's going to be no words anywhere telling you what that sculpture is? Somewhere you'll at least know what the title is and what the name of the person is. You know what I mean? Nothing can really exist without words, and words cannot exist without the world outside, which is non-textual. However, it's that interlocking which interests me, and it's an interlocking that kind of transposes itself to what you have mentioned in your question, the interlocking of culture, the relations between nations which share the same space and have shared the same history. So in other words, there are lots of entanglements, and I am quite interested in kind of finding my pathway through those entanglements, be they textual and non-textual, be they of different nations, be they of languages, be they of emotions. But I'm kind of trying to disentangle those threads.
So if you're looking at partition, you're really trying to understand what happened, especially if you're looking at Pakistan and what becomes Pakistan and Bangladesh. You really need to look at entanglements on these two countries that are unified and split into two. And one of the ways that you explore this, one of these non-narrative sources of culture that you try to use to get at the complexity of this past is maps. And you talk about how maps are used by artists, maps are used by novelists, really to challenge maybe more simplistic ways of looking at these countries and to dig into some of the forgotten connections between them. So I was hoping to talk a little bit about how maps work. On the one hand, maps seem like a classic tool that's used to construct national identities, but you try to take it in a different direction.
Absolutely. Now, this is a very fascinating point you make. Pakistan and Bangladesh. In 1947, when the partition was agreed on through various machinations, the corridors of power, it was a very bizarre map that emerged. We had India, a nation called India, and on two sides of it, there were two wings of another nation called Pakistan. And these wings were called East Pakistan and West Pakistan. And I really found, it quite surreal, that such an experiment could even be sustained for the 2 decades and a bit that it was. Because what happened is that by 1971, this bold experiment unraveled. There was civil war in Pakistan, and the East Wing became the new country of Bangladesh. So, at the very recently, a Bangladeshi artist and writer, Naeem Mohaimen, has written a new book, and he's calling it Bangladesh, which is Midnight's Third Child. You see what I mean? He's riffing off Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children. So there's this sense that Pakistan and India emerged, and that was not the end of the story. Within, 2 decades, in 1971, you had a third country emerge, which was Bangladesh. So what happened to the map? Bangladesh superimposed itself on the territory, the region, which was called between 1947 and 71, East Pakistan. The borders didn't really change, but the name and identity of the space was utterly transformed. And with that transformation, the geopolitics of the entire space altered, because India no longer had to contend with a hostile nation, quote unquote, Pakistan, on two. It was not flanked anymore by two wings of the same nation. It now had Pakistan on one side of it and Bangladesh on the other side of it. So the entanglement that we are talking about, a kind of foundational entanglement between Pakistan and Bangladesh, there's a third party in there, which is India, and we cannot kind of forget it. People who specialize in war studies or have traced exactly what happened in 1971, will say that the 1971 so-called, language is important here. The Bangladeshis would call it the liberation and independence of Bangladesh. In Pakistan, I think it's still called the Civil War, which ended in a secession of the wing, Eastern wing, to become Bangladesh. Whatever it is, India definitely, it's known that the Indian army played a role in this, because it was to India's geopolitical advantage to not be flanked by a hostile country on two sides of it, but have possibly a friendly country on its eastern wing, and so on and so forth. So, this is just the geopolitics and the military dimension of the matter. Emotions, families, friendships, institutions were horribly entangled because of this two-step process, which started in 47 and kind of reverberated, bounced back in 1971 to reshape the entire space, which was actually not reshaped at all, because the boundaries, the political borders did not take new contours, but the names had changed. And I remain fascinated by what actually all this means for the people living through these spaces.
And my sense is that, because you're looking at this at two levels, so you're looking at Bangladesh and Pakistan as being one country, and then you're looking at these cultural actors, could be an archaeologist, could be an artist, and they're trying to construct an identity. They're trying to find a usable past for these two areas. And they're digging into this region. It's a new country, but it's a region with lots of history. So they're trying to pick and choose and unearth the useful elements. And then when that project unravels, there's a forgetting of that connection, and then you're looking at later generation of cultural actors, whether it's a novelist or an artist, who are using these maps to remind us of this period of time where there was this unified project, and so these artists are using maps as a memory trigger, while the nations are kind of moving on and trying to construct new usable paths, new identities, and they're trying to forget that period of unity.
No, absolutely. And what I try to do in the book is also show how Indian cultural actors were impacted by what was going on in Pakistan, which would ultimately lead to Bangladesh. I mean, it's kind of, it's a kind of... it would seem logical that people in Pakistan and Bangladesh would be involved in what happened to Pakistan and Bangladesh. You know what I'm saying? But what I show is that India and Indian cultural actors of different kinds were never unimpacted by what was happening to Pakistan during the period 1947 to 1971. And because of this, actually, I realized as I was writing the book, I'm like, oh my God, this is a book about East Pakistan, a place that doesn't exist anymore on any map. I realized that it was formative, actually, in this intricate balancing act between three parties. Two parties that became three parties, and how then the memory was managed between and amongst all these groups. So for me, I understood that at the core of my book lay this vanished space, East Pakistan, but it was not vanished. It had vanished from the map to be renamed Bangladesh, but it had remained in people's minds and memories as an active space of formation and a newness that had impacted everyone in South Asia after 1947. And after 1971, it continued, its afterlives continued in these kind of cultural and creative maps that you're talking about.
So also it seems that these cultural sources, so whether you're trying to delve into this period where Pakistan and Bangladesh were unified. You have maps as a memory trigger, but also you have movies and novels that serve as a means of kind of digging into what that actually meant, the separation, what happened. The violence, the ways in which people's lives were affected, the reasons why that project didn't work out, and my sense is that this critical approach to that past, you don't get that through the national story. That Pakistan and Bangladesh want to forget and move on, construct their new histories. So if you're trying to understand, well, how can these non-narrative cultural sources help promote healing and reconciliation? In part, you might argue, well, they offer a more critical take on that history.
I would say that it's not just, in fact, a critical take that often these creative responses or memorializations of the East Pakistan period offer. Actually, they offer a more, I wouldn't even say nostalgic, I would say they actually allow the expression of feelings that are almost deemed contraband, You can't feel certain things if you're a citizen of a certain nation. You cannot feel affection. You cannot feel a connection for a past that had to be left behind, for leftovers that still persist spatially and in other ways on other sides of borders. These connections, I think, the creative responses to difficult pasts are important, not just because they're critical, but because they can embrace other possibilities and options and show them as meaningful, emotionally and intellectually still meaningful. And that's the healing power. You see what I mean? A critical work can be done by the intellect, but the work of healing must actually be done by the emotional dimension of our existences. And that's what a person who creatively responds to the past does. And my task as a literary critic is to illuminate or point to those alternatives, and say, this is what they're trying to say, this is what they're trying to express. And those are the lessons that we can all learn from. So to give you an example, it's always good to talk from examples. I have opened my book with the voice and words of a very important singer, Firoza Begum. Firoza Begum was like the voice of Bangladesh. She was a beautiful singer of Bengali, Bengali music, poetry by particularly the writer known as, his name was Nazrul Islam. Nazrul Islam also was a very interesting figure. He was Bengali, kind of divided, if you like, between Indian Bengal and Bangladesh. And Firoza Begum gave voice to many of his compositions. And what I quote from her in the beginning of my book is an interview where she remembers a confused period of her life around 1947, when her family, like many Indian Muslim families, were wondering whether are they going to go to Pakistan, are they going to remain in what was become India, and this kind of disorientation, because no decision was clear or easy, is what she remembers. And then she says, I became sick. I almost stopped singing because of all this. By this time, she was already an established radio artist. So, she had a career and she was well known. And she found that she was almost like, her creativity was almost blocked because of what was happening. This is a common story. Again, this happened to a number of people. And then, I pointed out in my analysis that she is someone whose music was broadcast through the Pakistan, radio stations. And she was an artist who was recording for East Pakistan. There was a period in her life where she's not able to really remember. She's remembering the movement between India and what became Bangladesh, but actually she was moving between India and Pakistan. And as a Bangladeshi singer, which is what she ended up as, she does not perhaps find it comfortable to go back to the period of East Pakistan, but her voice was broadcast and recorded during that era, and people in Pakistan remember that she sang there. And she herself also sang Urdu songs, which is a language which she was forced to distance herself from when she became an artist of Bangladesh. So these sorts of leftovers, these affective contours which complicate the black and white picture of partition, I think that's the kind of nuance that comes through in her song. It's not coming through in her narrative of what happened to her, but when you listen to her with that knowledge, you think, she's actually unable to perhaps express openly a formative period of her life which happened in Pakistan. But what happens if we try to remind people of that? Would that be a way forward in making people of Pakistan, Bangladesh, and even India think differently about what is still shared, So East Pakistan and its memory becomes a space of reconciliation rather than a space of separation and, a space of bitterness, because there was a lot of there was a genocide. People call it a genocide of Bengalis by Pakistanis. Pakistanis again turn to India and say that you aided and abetted Bangladesh in becoming, in seceding. So all sorts of ill feelings swirl around this space, but there are also memories of shared, intimacies. And that's the kind of sharing that I am interested in excavating and bringing back in front of us.
So would you put these earlier, really like first generation cultural actors, and you feature an archaeologist and you feature this artist and their kind of common project to build a shared national identity after 1947 for Pakistan and Bangladesh. Do you see this as it's a broader project of an effort to try to find a united form of culture?
Well, what I did in that chapter, so there's a chapter in my book where I talk about, as you point out, the role of archaeology in trying to solve some problems of the past. Okay, so what are these problems? The fact is that in 1947, shifting the focus away from India to what's going on in Pakistan, you see that you have this nation, as I've said, which assumes a very difficult shape, that of two physically disparate disjoint wings, so to speak, and the body in between these wings is India, hostile territory, thousands of miles of it. You don't even have a land route between East and West Pakistan. You have to fly. Or you can take a very long boat ride, all along the coast of India. I mean, it's an impossible situation, right? How is it going to be sustained? We know about Benedict Anderson's famous and very useful concept of imagined communities, right? So how do you imagine a community that's literally split into these two geographically disparate and linguistically, culturally very different zones? What certain intellectuals did, and that's what I show in this chapter, is that they go back to the very idea of soil itself, and they go back to the idea of terracotta, which is baked earth, as we know. It's a medium used to create sculptures. And they go back to terracotta as a medium to think about connectivity between these completely disjunct spaces. And interestingly enough, they also go to a culture that precedes these conflicts between Hinduism and Islam on the subcontinent, which have precipitated the partition, of the space, and that is Buddhism. So I show how an archaeologist like Professor Dani, who was one of the founding figures of Pakistan's kind of, Pakistan's invention of its past, really. Professor Dani delved into the kind of mysteries, shall we say, of Buddhist archaeological remains, which were like profusely scattered in the parts of Pakistan that border on Central Asia and Afghanistan and so on. And he went and he did his excavations there, and he used that material in a way to try and find a usable past for Pakistan, but one that would actually bring and unite its eastern and western wings, because the part that became Bangladesh, East Pakistan, also had Buddhist remnants. So terracotta and Buddhism kind of linked together to give certain people in that early phase of nation building of Pakistan via media, a way to think of a cohesive national narrative that could perhaps suture these disparate wings. What happened, though, is that was a failed project. But often failures are also important to tell us about utopias and unrealized dreams. It failed because of, as one knows very well, I mean, there was there were a lot of sociocultural disparities in Pakistan, and there was a hegemony, cultural hegemony over the Bengali-speaking part of Pakistan, which was obviously focused in East Pakistan, and the cultural project of trying to look at terracotta to create a unifying narrative, a unifying history. Shall we say, it could not bear the weight of actual politics on the ground, of politics of inequality and of linguistic and cultural, a kind of form of apartheid almost that was happening in Pakistan against the Bengali language and its culture. So when, therefore, 1971 happened, despite the efforts of people like Professor Dani, what was very interesting is that narrative of terracotta and Buddhism kind of went underground, and that's what I showed, through tracking Dani's career and the stances he took after 1971, because he was still alive and he was still a professor and he was still, forming the, participating in the intellectual work and life of Pakistan after 1971. And the story changed, This is why I'm distrustful of stories. You see what I mean? However, nobody can remove the terracotta. Nobody can say Buddhist artifacts don't exist in Pakistan. If you go to Lahore Museum, you will still see Gandhara art. So in other words, the stories may change and shift, but the materials remain, The materials of memory remain to remind us
So there are these
Yeah.
terracotta elements of when you're looking at this period from 1947 to 71. There are these experts who are trying to find these common cultural elements they see in terracotta that carry over from Pakistan into the region of what becomes Bangladesh. And then you get to 1971, and there's this split. And how do Pakistan and Bangladesh move off in very different directions in constructing their
Yeah,
understanding of their
exactly.
national past?
So what happens is that in Pakistan, as we know, again, there's a to simplify complexities, but I think it's fair enough to say that a process of Islamicization starts taking precedence. Regional differences or regional reflexes in culture and language and so on. It's not that people stop speaking, say, for example, Sindhi, or they stop singing Punjabi qawwalis or whatever. But there is a sense in which the national story is one of an modern Islamic nation, which means Islamicization, and people like Dani are actually changing the tune, and they are agreeing with this, or they are lending their voice to this new understanding of what Pakistan means. And in Bangladesh, that burden of terracotta, if you like, passes into a wholehearted what can we say, valorization of a folkloric element. In Bangladesh after 1971, what would be seen within the kind of long durée vision of South Asian history as the culture of the little folk, the culture of of marginalized groups, which emblematizes itself in small terracotta toys, for example, which could be sold at folk bazaars and little village markets. Those become important. They take on the burden. We are a nation which valorizes our little things, our small terracotta toys. And Zainul Abidin, very famous painter from Bangladesh. I mean, he was from East Pakistan. He was Dani's contemporary. I show their interrelations in my chapter. Zainul Abidin now becomes one of the key intellectual figures in the new Bangladesh, and he actually creates a museum of terracotta toys. I find this very, very significant and a good illustration of how terracotta takes on another life in Bangladesh. But terracotta has a life in India too. And that's what my chapter is interested in. Sandwiched in between what's going on with terracotta in these two wings of Pakistan, there is an Indian story of terracotta, and it's in kind of concert, It's being inflected by what's happening around it in Pakistan's east and west wings, and then ultimately Pakistan and Bangladesh.
Now, you do mention some of the monuments. I was hoping you might discuss a little bit, especially in Bangladesh. I thought it was fascinating, this concept of the sealed moment and the way in which these monuments are constructed. Could you comment on that a little?
Now, very quickly, what happened in Bangladesh is that the achievement of a country of one's own, shall we say, for the Bengalis who were finding themselves subjugated in the arrangements of Pakistan. This idea that we've finally arrived, what Mohammed calls this midnight's third child, the sense that we are now here. We are a nation finally in our own right. 1971. This moment becomes of extreme importance again in shaping that imagined community, which is now going to be Bangladesh. And what I've pointed out is that this emphasis on 1971 almost predicates a de-emphasis on 1947. Nations don't like messy beginnings. You know what I mean? No nation will have a story which says we were complicated. It was all very confusing. Nobody knew who was coming in. That's not helpful in creating clean and easily mobilized nationalist narratives. And in Bangladesh, that was done by almost chipping away everything that happened before 1971 and presenting 1971 as the moment of emergence for the nation, and that's what I call the sealed moment. You have to seal off the memory of what was before that, not between 1947 and 71, the period of participation in the project of Pakistan. The same elites and the same people who had wanted to be Pakistani were now saying we don't want to be Pakistani. But of course, this means that were they mistaken in 1947? This is a very complicated ontology for a nation. Did you make a mistake that ultimately led to a good thing? Do two wrongs make a right? Should we simply forget what happened before? And this particular two-step process in coming into being as a nation, 1947 followed by 1971, I think is distilled into an unwavering and almost unquestionable emphasis on the importance of 1971 as the moment of the nation's emergence in Bangladesh and for Bangladesh. And that's what I call the sealed moment. And I have seen that phenomenologically, if you like, manifested in certain monuments to Bangladesh's moment, of emergence in 1971. You've got Bangladesh's, if you go to Dhaka, you see very many monuments to 1971. This is interesting and a bit different from the memorialization of 1947 in India. And these monuments, for me, represent a kind of assertion of the sealed moment, but also because they are monuments made by creative and sensitive artists who are not into propaganda, they also leave open certain possibilities for reminding you that it was a messy moment that should be prized open, not just sealed. You see what I'm saying? The moment is presented as both one that's sealed, but therefore can be unsealed.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And I think you also point out that one of the roles that the cultural actors you study take on is criticizing these new national memories. And you have a really great example with a particular Pakistani visual artist who's very critical of this new shift towards rooting the country in Islamic past.
I think you're referring to my discussion of Bani Abidi?
Yes.
Yes, I mean, she's an amazing artist, and she's. 10 years ago, I wrote about her. She's very, she's extremely well established, and she has she has produced even more and more stuff in the years since. I have in fact written on her recent work 2 years ago, where there was a big exhibition of all her work in Berlin, and I was in Berlin at that time. And what I noted through this small examination of one of her images, an almost ironic image of a young man trying to be a soldier of Islam. I think that was the on a kind of camel. She's very ironic, and she's done quite a lot of this sort of work in which she ironically both presents and undercuts this the insistence that the nation of Pakistan was created on an Islamicist understanding. I think thinking of nation of Pakistan as an Islamic nation really, I think, obscures again the currents of a utopian modernity that created it, and which have been kind of swept under the carpet or will to be forgotten because of 1971 and the new emphases that had to be furnished, to explain to the national collective psyche what had happened, to kind of rationalize it and move on. So the work of people like Bani Abidi, I think, is very important. Also, Kamila Shamsi, a novelist whom I've written about in my chapter on maps, because she is indeed interested in maps and mapping East Pakistan onto the again memory and psyche of contemporary Pakistanis. So there are quite a few people. What is interesting to me is these are people who are kind of my generation, we're all kind of in our 50s now, I suppose. And therefore, I'm also drawing some generational links. There are generations who remember and generations who forget and generations who want to remember again. And we, myself, and many of the people I bring together in my book are of this kind of third generation since 1947. It doesn't matter whether you're Pakistani, Bengali, Indian or whatever, Bangladeshi. We are of that third generation from that moment of 1947. And so we can recognize and pick up on this post-amnesiac, desire that I am defining in my book.
Well, that's your point, too, that this third generation, often people in the diaspora, they have connections through social media, the internet that didn't exist before, that allowed them to transcend national boundaries and barriers, and maybe they're more emotionally detached, you might argue, from that past, that might give them more of a possibility to dialogue.
I don't know about detachment, Detachment is such a difficult word. We may not be attached. We never had any physical attachment.
Critical distance. Have more critical distance from the past.
I don't know. I think sometimes, if only that were the case, then I think there would be no identity wars or battles, don't you think? I don't really feel that the logic of temporal and spatial distance really works with emotions when it comes to attachment.
I'm coming off of reading a book on memory activism in Germany, and one of the differences was the later generations of memory actors who weren't personally implicated in
yes.
the Nazi past versus the newer generation of memory actors who came out of East Germany. For them, it was much more of a lived, direct emotional experience, and how they approached the past in very different ways because of that.
I think that's a great example, because what you see with East and West Germany, or what was former East and former West Germany, is a kind of temporal disjunction. There's a disjuncture because of Cold War politics. Certain structures of memory were allowed in the East, which were not allowed in the West, and vice versa, you see. And now, in the present, when all these groups are drawn together in the same space, which is Germany, unified, but they come with different trajectories, don't they, of memory, remembering and forgetting, and also feeling of implication and connection with a very difficult past. So that's a very good example about, that's a very good parallel, I think, useful parallel to understand how things work in South Asia, because with this idea of Midnight's third child, you already see the sense that there was the first and the second and then the third. So, there are different layers there of implication, of entanglement and connection. But I think it's fair to say that, of course, wherever you are, you find yourself, whichever country you find yourself closely connected to the closest, shall we say, because of citizenship or because of citizenship of your parents or whatever, I think there is definitely a temporal distance from the generation that lived through 1947, right? And that is something that is both, that's a trigger, I think, for a fresh wave of memory work. When you think, but those people, we don't have any tangible connection with the past anymore. Our grandparents have all passed on, and yet we are still feeling the urge to go back to that moment. We still want to work out and figure out what it means for us. So I think there's both things happening. The temporal distance and very often spatial dislocation definitely create certain conditions for for memory work, which are different conditions to say that of an anterior generation. but it doesn't make the urge for memory work go away, or doesn't make that urge less acute,
Okay. My sense is from the very start of your book, where you begin with, and if it wasn't for my fear of copyright infringement, I would have started with the Dean Martin song,
Yes.
Mambo Italiano, which I enjoyed discovering and listening to. And my sense is whether you're listening to the song or you're looking at family pictures, as you're really trying to understand the emotional connection of the generations before you. That it's almost like you're looking at this generation later and trying to understand connections that maybe no longer exist, attachments to places that have changed. So maybe that's what I meant more by critical distance.
The point is this, that somehow mysteriously, maybe even, what seems to be in common is that our attachments actually don't decrease. They come coupled perhaps with curiosity, because we don't have lived experience of certain spaces anymore. But that doesn't make us less curious. And this, I think, is a feature definitely of South Asian post-amnesia that I'm trying to talk about. Wherever we are, we always think about what were my grandparents doing, and what kind of lives did they have? And we feel that we cannot access it, not just because that was a different moment in the past, but because that's now in another country. So the past is literally another country, And what I find is quite interesting for me, I decided that I would start with the story of my family, because it is a family that, like countless other families for whom the past is in another country or in several different countries, we have devised our own protocols, our own rituals of trying to keep that attachment integral and intact, through memory triggers of different kinds, attachment triggers of different kinds. And for me, it was easy to speak from the perspective, of course, of my own family, which, like the East Pakistan that I spoke about, has a spectral and ghostly center in a house that existed in East Pakistan. And now that still stands in Bangladesh. But like East Pakistan, it stands, but is no longer what it used to be. It used to be our family home, but now it's a school and college for women, in Bangladesh. And yet nobody can forget this home in my family. People still keep talking about it. People circulate photos of it. People have stories about it. And a culture developed amongst the siblings and their children who were born of the people who were born in that house. And that culture is still, again, activated through memories like that song, which I started with. And I deliberately started with that song because it's a song by Dean Martin. It's a song in English. And I wanted to show that to be from a Muslim family that was partitioned in different ways through 1947 and 71, it's not about lamenting the loss overtly of a Muslimness or whatever, of a religiosity. It's about things that make your family, you know what I mean? About songs, about food, about the way you hung out together, people, your cousins that you met and you can't meet anymore. It was important to somehow short circuit a set of expectations people might have of what happened to Muslim people during the partition by saying, well, people found that they missed singing a Dean Martin song with their cousins, and they still did it nevertheless whenever they could, and they still sing it together through social media, So it's kind of queering the pitch a little bit. It's trying to say that there's a story of modernity here that is equally important for me to piece together through what happened because of partition.
Anania Kabir is professor of English literature at King's College London. She is the author of Partition's Post-Amnesias, 1947-1971, and Modern South Asia. Anania, thanks so much for joining me today on Realms of Memory.
It was really important to talk about these things which are so precious and important to us. Thank you, Rick.
Next month, we'll turn to Serbia and the memory of the wars in Yugoslavia. We'll talk with Professor Orly Friedman from Singadunum University in Belgrade about her recent book, Memory Activism and Digital Practices After Conflict, Unwanted Memories. Word of mouth is often the way we discover things we like and appreciate. If you've enjoyed this or other episodes of Realms of Memory, please share a link. Thanks again for listening. I'm Rick Dadarian. See you soon.